Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the Rietveld Academy for inviting me to organize this day, and thanks so much to all of you for being here and joining us. And before we get started with today's program of speakers, I'd like to say a few words to frame the day. And I'm going to do that by staging an encounter with technodiversity and three related concepts and arguments. And I do this in the spirit of extending and enriching technodiversity, but also to put a critical pressure on the term. So first, let's look at Yuck Hui's formulation of technodiversity. So what does the term mean? Now, Hui himself answers this briefly in a 2020 interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books. He states, quote, "Instead of a universal history describing one technology with various stages of development, we can step back for a moment and instead describe technological development as involving different cosmotechnics. I call this technodiversity. And here we must revisit the question of locality, which doesn't necessarily entail that we take part in a discussion of ethnic groups and ideologies, Aryan, German, Russian, or whatever. We must rather think of locality in terms of systems of knowledge," end quote. So in this passage, we've also encountered Hui's other main philosophical concept, which is cosmotechnics. And together, we can understand these terms as diverging from an understanding of the world as only framed by a singular European history and trajectory of epistemes, orders, and technologies that have developed and persisted within them. So for instance, it's easy enough in the West to think that Silicon Valley and today's tech giants have completely totalized technology, meaning that there would be no technology outside of what these companies produce. So alternatively, according to Hui, the world contains multiplicitous technical cosmologies, different worldviews and orders of understanding, making, and using technologies. So that is different cosmotechnics beyond Silicon Valley and the tech industry, for instance. And then this varying, differing technologies that emanate from these cosmotechnics make up and contribute to technodiversity. So Hui provides an example of cosmotechnics and technodiversity in this interview. This is another quote. "I grew up in Hong Kong. My father had a Chinese pharmacy where he sold plants and herbs. Chinese pharmacists walk mountain paths collecting herbs to be made into medicines. Making medicine is a complicated procedure. Some plants must first be treated to extract the poisonous substances they contain before they can be made beneficial to human health. Chinese medicine is based on Taoist cosmology with yin, yang, and 5 kinds of qi. If, from a Western perspective, you approach a Chinese doctor and ask, 'Can you please show me your qi and prove that this energy exists?' the answer would be no. If you can't prove the existence of the energy at the base of your practice, how can you say that you practice a science?" So here lies the problem. But this doesn't mean that Chinese medicine isn't scientific. As an empirical science, it has functioned for 2,000 years based on a different epistemology. So for a long time in Hong Kong, Chinese medicine has been ranked lower than Western medicine. If you go to a Chinese doctor, it won't be covered by your health insurance because Chinese medicine is seen as unscientific, end quote. Now, on the website for our Technodiversity conference, a different quote from Hui headlines, quote, "Technodiversity involves thinking about divergences within technological development, such as cultural histories, that is to produce alternative technologies," end quote. So for me, a question emerges, how to produce alternative technologies, technodiversity. Now, Hui tells us in this interview, quote, "First, we must recognize the diversity, then we must develop it further." So more questions follow for me, because how does one recognize diversity? I'd wager here that recognition is a very complex process, its own kind of technology, and not something necessarily immediate, that is without mediation or innocent. And once this recognition is achieved, if it is, for what means and to what ends is technodiversity produced? And before I can answer these, another set of questions proceeds for me, which is the very question of diversity itself. Why has Hui formulated his concept as such? Diversity, It's a thorny term at best and has become synonymous with corporate and institutional logics that seek to capture and typically flatten what the term diversity supposedly holds within capitalist logics of administration and multiculturalism. So as far as contemporary critical thought goes, there are other terms like multiplicity, for instance, that strike me as possibly more apropos, that is, more in line with genealogies of critical and radical thinking that are committed to anti-capitalism and decolonization. As far as I can deduce, it seems to me that Hui has developed technodiversity in relation to the term biodiversity. Biodiversity is a term that was first developed in the 1980s that refers to the variety and variability of life on Earth. And etymologically, biodiversity originates from the Greek word bios and the Latin word diversitas, meaning variety or difference. Now, I'd like to flag this etymological relation between diversity and difference because as I turn to our first encounter that I wish to stage with technodiversity, another theory of diversity articulated some decades prior to Hui, there's a different way in which the diverse lands in relationship to difference. So this first encounter is with the Martinique philosopher, poet, and playwright Édouard Glissant, whose well-known formulation of opacity he describes as that which is, quote, beyond difference, which could be read here as beyond diversity. So in 1994, Glissant argued that the world is creolizing, or diversifying. And Glissant's understanding of creolization comes from Creole languages, which are languages that have mixed together to form something new, like Pidgin, for instance. And Glissant's criteria for creolization is that this process is to be, quote, mutually heterogeneous. Now, of course, Glissant was particularly interested in the colonial conditions of creolization, in which European languages and cultures mixed with indigeneity and the local tongues of those colonized and oppressed as a result of conquest and the transatlantic slave trade. But creolization as the world becoming mutually heterogeneous, Glissant resolutely celebrates this in his writings and lectures. Crucially, he describes creolization as that which is unforeseeable and unpredictable. And it is out of this process of creolization that diversity for Glissant emerges. Glissant writes, quote, diversity extends to include all the unexpected emergences, minorities that were yesterday still unknown and crushed by a monolithic thought system, fractal manifestations of sensibilities that reshape and rearrange themselves in new ways. All possibilities and all contradictions are inscribed in this diversity of the world, end quote. So in aesthetic terms, Glissant actually describes a poetics of diversity as a poetics of chaos, what he terms the immeasurability of immeasurability, skewed from any dominant universalism. Now, this is notably quite different from Hui's use of the word alternative when describing what makes a technology diverse, because the alternative is a term that is still in relation from that which is dominant. So Glissant has also stated that which protects the diverse we call opacity, which is where the title of today's program comes from. Opacity is Glissant's term for an ontological relational condition of existence that is never fully knowable or transparent through dominant hegemonic knowledge systems, and aligns here with diversity as unforeseeable and unpredictable. That is the real chaos of the total world. So the subject here being the diverse, and the structure of relation being opacity. And Glissant has argued that we all have a right to this poetics of chaos, that everyone has the right to opacity, the right to diversify. Now in 2024, the world has changed considerably since Glissant wrote these words in the 1990s. Creolization has continued as well as been impeded, oppressed, and so we must ask what protects the diverse as Glissant understands it today. And how does diversity, that is, difference according to its etymology, actually protect and enable the thriving of the diverse? Or rather, does diversity today actually capture the diverse? So what is this world that the diverse exists within today? And to answer this question, I'm going to turn to the second encounter I wish to stage with technodiversity. In 1995, feminist science and technology studies scholar Donna Haraway, in her classic A Manifesto for Cyborgs, theorized the informatics of domination as a networked computational reconfiguration of what Black feminist theorist Bell Hooks termed imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So Haraway writes, quote, "My sketch is set by the extent and importance of rearrangement in worldwide social relations tied to science and technology. I argue for a politics rooted in claims about fundamental changes in the nature of class, race, and gender, and an emerging system of world order analogous in its novelty and scope to that created by industrial capitalism. We are living through a moment from an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information system, from all work to all play, a deadly game. Simultaneously material and ideological, from the comfortable old hierarchical dominations to the scary new networks I have called the informatics of domination." Now, Haraway's concept of the informatics of domination has been surprisingly overlooked, but I would argue that it is a capacious and vital term, and it provides an intersectional feminist genealogy for naming the ways in which imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy extends through domination, informatic domination, which includes colonization, right, through not only informatics, but also computation and networks. So Haraway connects the informatics of domination to the authority given to code. She states that, quote, "Communication sciences and modern biologies are constructed by a common move, the translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange." Now, we can understand the particular view of code here as a common language from which to control the world as the cosmotechnical view of the informatics of domination. So what becomes of the diverse here? As the informatics of domination produces computational technologies that capture and colonize that which is unforeseeable, unpredictable, and immeasurable. You just have to think of predictive analytics here, for example. How then to protect the diverse? And what becomes of diversity in the informatics of domination? So, and now for the third and last encounter. Feminist and critical race scholar Sara Ahmed, in her 2012 book On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life, describes diversity within university and institutional context, which is also to say diversity in the informatics of domination. And Ahmed explains diversity as, quote, "shorthand for inclusion as an institutional replacement term, taking the place of earlier terms such as, quote, equal opportunities or, quote, anti-racism." Ahmed writes, "The use of diversity within universities has been treated as a symptom of what academics have called the corporatization of the university. This is a diversity as a market term, which is why Ahmed claims that, quote, diversity obscures." So Ahmed asks, what recedes when diversity becomes a point of view? So at the same time, Ahmed does clarify that diversity does work, as in it does things. And it does things that align with the aspirations of Glissant and Hui, even if embroiled within non-existent or non-innocent conditions, as Haraway would call them. So Glissant, Haraway, Ahmed. Having these three thinkers' writings encounter technodiversity raises important questions on the very constitution of diversity and its means and ends, as well as the dominant world that manifests a dominant configuration of diversity today in technologies and beyond. So I want to return to the question I started with, how to produce alternative, or rather diverse technologies. If we follow Hui, how to recognize diversity as the first step in doing this, and trying to take into account the best senses of both Hui and Glissant's formulations of diversity and the diverse. How can technodiversity be used to protect and nurture the diverse today? So our program today will not provide a unified thesis on these questions. Rather, this day will share glimmers, desires, imaginaries, propositions, practices, theories, and lived experiences from an intergenerational, transnational gathering of artists and scholars that I would describe as committed to surviving in and beyond the informatics of domination, committed in their own ways to Glissant's formulation of the diverse. So throughout the day, we will experience something like the diverse's techno-diversity, a range of critiques and constitutions, protections and celebrations that are anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, and queer, including presentations on indigenous futurism, computational hexes, viral love, opacity and cybernetics, and gendered robots and vampires. And the artists and scholars gathered here demonstrate how to create, use, dream, and think with techno-diversity in code and text, image and sound, performance and protest, seeking protection and liberation from the informatics of domination, but also alliance and pleasure along the way. Now, I don't want to say much about the program at all. I would rather you encounter it as it unfolds throughout the day. And in closing, I do want to highlight that I have been in intellectual and artistic dialogues with most of today's presenters for quite some time. I really do feel deeply connected to all of them. They have taught me, literally some of them have taught me when I was a student. They have inspired me. I'm friends and colleagues with some, and others I hope to develop friendship with through today's discussions. And I am most excited about bringing them together here to have this collective time for exchange so they can encounter each other, but also so they can share this time with all of you.